No one was laughing an hour later, but they were all laughing when Elara walked in. They saw a quiet girl in a simple borrowed dress, a footnote in the grand story of the Beaumont family. They saw her as a temporary arrangement, a stepping stone for their golden boy, Julian. They had no idea she was the author of the final chapter, the one who would burn the whole book down to its binding. The laughter was a bright, brittle sound in the cavernous drawing room, echoing off the high, frescoed ceilings and the cold marble floors. It was the sound of casual cruelty, the effortless dismissal of someone they had already deemed insignificant. Elara felt it land on her skin like a physical blow, a shower of sharp, invisible stones. She kept her chin up, a habit drilled into her by a grandfather who had always told her that dignity was the only armor that could never be stripped away. Julian found her by the towering French doors that overlooked the manicured gardens, his handsome face a mask of practiced charm. He slid an arm around her waist, his touch proprietary and cold. "There you are," he murmured, his voice a low hum, meant only for her yet loud enough for those nearby to appreciate his attentiveness. "I was looking for you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were scanning the room, counting the important faces, weighing the value of the connections being forged. Elara was just another asset to be managed. She knew this, somewhere deep down, but had refused to acknowledge the chilling truth of it. He led her toward the center of the room, where his mother, Beatrice, held court. She was a woman sculpted from ice and ambition, her silver hair coiled into a perfect, unforgiving chignon. Her eyes, the same shade of Arctic blue as her son's, raked over Elara's simple dress with a flicker of disdain so faint that only Elara, who had spent months studying its nuances, could detect it. Beatrice was talking to a cluster of people whose net worth could likely buy a small country. When she saw Julian approach with Elara in tow, her thin lips curved into a smile that was more a baring of teeth than an expression of warmth. "Ah, here she is," Beatrice announced, her voice carrying across the polite chatter. The laughter that had greeted Elara's entrance subsided, replaced by a current of expectant silence. Every eye in the room turned to them. Elara felt her heart begin to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. The one Julian had vaguely warned her about, calling it a small family matter, a formality. Beatrice gestured to a small ornate table where a man in a dark suit stood waiting. On the table lay a sheaf of papers bound in a heavy leather folder. It looked official. It looked final. "Elara, darling," Beatrice began, her tone dripping with condescending sweetness. "As you know, the Beaumont family has a legacy to protect. A legacy of strength, of prudence. We don't leave things to chance." Julian squeezed her waist, a silent command to be pliant, to be agreeable. "It's just the prenuptial agreement, my love," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Standard procedure, you understand." Elara didn't understand. They had never discussed this, not once. She had given him her heart, her trust, her future. She had believed they were building a life together, a partnership. But this felt like a business transaction, a hostile takeover of her life. She looked at the papers, then at the faces surrounding her. They were all watching, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to smug satisfaction. They were witnesses to her formal induction into a role she had never auditioned for, the compliant, powerless wife. The lawyer cleared his throat. "If you'll just sign on the indicated lines, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice as dry as old parchment. He held out a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. It felt absurdly heavy in the sudden stillness of the room. Elara's hand trembled as she reached for it. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and hurt. Why here? Why now? Why in front of all these people? It was a performance, a demonstration of power. They were showing her and everyone else exactly where she stood in their gilded world. She was an outsider, a guest whose welcome was conditional upon her complete and total surrender. She looked at Julian, her eyes pleading for an explanation, for a shred of the love she thought they shared. He just smiled, a tight, reassuring gesture that offered no reassurance at all. "It's for the best, Elara. It protects us both." But it didn't feel like protection. It felt like a cage. She looked down at the first page. The legal jargon was dense. impenetrable, but a few phrases leaped out at her. Waiver of all claims to Beaumont assets. No entitlement to marital property in the event of dissolution. A one-time payment of... The number was insulting. It was less than the value of the watch on Julian's wrist. It was a severance package for a dismissed employee, not a provision for a wife. Beatrice's voice cut through her daze, sharp and impatient. "Don't bother trying to read it, dear. It's all quite complicated. You are a decorative piece, Elara. Beautiful, but silent. Your signature is all that is required of you tonight." The words landed with the force of a slap. A decorative piece. The room swam before her eyes. The polite smiles of the guests seemed to morph into predatory grins. The laughter she had heard earlier now echoed in her ears, mocking her naivety. They didn't see her. They saw an object, a pretty accessory to be acquired and controlled. And Julian, the man she loved, was standing right there, allowing it to happen, endorsing it. She felt a sudden, chilling clarity. It was as if a veil had been ripped from her eyes. Every little slight, every dismissive comment, every time she had been made to feel small and unworthy, it all coalesced into this one brutal moment. This was not love. This was an acquisition. Her hand, which had been trembling, grew still. The pen felt cool and solid in her grasp. She looked up, her gaze meeting Beatrice's cold, triumphant stare. She saw the flicker of victory in the older woman's eyes. Beatrice thought she had won. They all did. They were waiting for the quiet girl to sign her life away, to accept her designated role as the beautiful, silent ornament. Elara took a deep breath. She thought of her grandfather, of the strength he had tried to instill in her. She thought of the old leather-bound ledger he had given her, the one she had never truly understood. He had told her it was the key to her independence, a shield against a world that would try to diminish her. She had been too in love, too trusting to ever believe she would need it. How wrong she had been. She placed the pen down on the table, its click unnaturally loud in the silent room. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was steady. It was firm. It was a sound they had never heard from her before. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Beatrice's perfectly sculpted face hardened, the mask of civility cracking. Julian's smile vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief, then irritation. "Elara, don't be ridiculous," he hissed, his grip on her waist tightening until it hurt. "Sign the papers." "No," she repeated, pulling away from his grasp. She looked directly at Beatrice, her gaze unwavering. "I will not be signing anything tonight, or any other night." She turned, and without another word she walked out of the room. The silence that followed her was heavier, more profound, than any sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a decorative piece stepping down from its pedestal and walking out of the gallery. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what she had left behind, and for the first time, she knew exactly where she was going. The long drive back to the small apartment she had refused to give up felt different. It was no longer a retreat from their world, but a return to her own. The grief was a physical weight in her chest, a crushing pressure that made it hard to breathe. Betrayal was a bitter metallic taste in her mouth. She had loved Julian, or at least the man she had believed him to be. She had built her entire future around him, a future that had just been revealed as a carefully constructed lie. She let herself into the quiet solitude of her apartment. It was modest, filled with worn, comfortable furniture, and books stacked in every corner. It was a world away from the cold opulence of the Beaumont estate. Here she was not a decorative piece. Here she was herself. For hours she sat in the dark, letting the waves of pain wash over her. She cried, for the love that had been a lie, for the trust she had so foolishly given away, for the woman she had been just that morning, hopeful, naive, and completely blind. But, as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the window, the tears subsided, the grief began to burn away, leaving something else in its place, something hard and cold and sharp, anger. Anger. A deep, crystalline anger that clarified everything. Beatrice's words echoed in her mind. A decorative piece, beautiful, but silent. They had never seen her. They had only seen what they wanted her to be. They had underestimated her so profoundly, so completely, that it was almost laughable. They had no idea who she was. They had no idea who her grandfather was, and they had no idea what he had left her. She got up and went to the old wooden chest at the foot of her bed. She lifted the heavy lid and pushed aside the lavender-scented linens her grandmother had made. There, at the bottom, was the ledger. It was bound in dark green leather, worn smooth with age. The cover was blank, unassuming. To anyone else it would look like an old empty journal, but Elara knew better. Her grandfather, Arthur Hayes, had given it to her on her 18th birthday, just a few months before he passed away. Arthur had been a strange and wonderful man, a brilliant engineer, and an even more brilliant businessman who had despised the spotlight. He had built a vast, sprawling empire of subsidiary companies, patents, and holdings, all managed through a complex web of trusts and shell corporations that made him virtually invisible. And he preferred old books to board meetings and overalls to bespoke suits. The world of high finance saw him as an eccentric recluse, a relic from a bygone era. They had no idea he was the puppeteer pulling strings they couldn't even see. He was the one who had truly understood the nature of power. "The world will try to put you in a box, Ellie," he had told her, his voice raspy with age, his eyes still sharp and clear. He had tapped the cover of the ledger. "They will judge you by your cover, by your gender, by the softness of your voice. They will assume you are simple. Let them. Their assumptions are their weakness, and it will be your greatest strength. Everything you need to be your own woman, to never need anyone else's permission to live your life, is in this book. Don't open it until you have to. Don't use it until you're sure you found someone who loves you for you, and not for what you have. But if that day comes, when you realize the world is not as kind as you hoped, this will be your sword and your shield." She had thought his words were overly dramatic, the ramblings of a beloved old man who saw shadows where there were none. She had put the ledger away, content in her belief that the love she had found with Julian was real, that she would never need a sword or a shield. Now, his words felt like a prophecy. She had been so determined to be loved for herself that she had hidden the most powerful part of her inheritance, not just from the world but from herself. With trembling hands, she carried the ledger to her small kitchen table. The morning light fell across the worn leather. She opened it. The first page was not filled with numbers or legal text. It was a letter, written in her grandfather's familiar, spidery script. "My dearest Elara," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you have found yourself in a position where you need to know the truth. I am sorry if the world has hurt you. I tried to build a fortress to protect you, not of stone and steel, but of knowledge and independence. That fortress is contained within these pages." He went on to explain the structure of his empire, Hayes Industries. It wasn't one company, but hundreds, all interconnected, all privately held. He owned foundational patents for microchip manufacturing, logistics software that quietly ran half the shipping industry, and vast tracts of land in unassuming places that were rich in rare earth minerals. He had built a silent, invisible behemoth, and he had left it all to her. The subsequent pages were not filled with prose, but with codes, account numbers, and the names of 3 people: his lawyer, his accountant, and his chief operating officer. These were the only 3 people in the world who knew the full extent of his holdings, and who the new anonymous owner was. Elara stared at the pages, her mind struggling to comprehend the scale of it. She was not just comfortable. She was not just wealthy. She was a titan of industry, and had never even known it. The Beaumonts, with their flashy, debt-leveraged real estate company, were like children playing with toy blocks compared to the silent, solid fortress Arthur had built. The anger that had been simmering within her now cooled into a steely resolve. The Beaumonts had wanted her signature on a document that would have stripped her of a pittance. They had tried to acquire her, to make her a silent, decorative part of their crumbling facade. They thought she was nothing. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Her grandfather had given her a sword and a shield. It was time to learn how to use them. The first call she made was to the lawyer listed in the ledger, a man named Marcus Thorne. His voice was gruff, elderly, But when she gave her name and the authentication code her grandfather had written down, his tone changed instantly. It became sharp, alert, and deeply respectful. "Miss Hayes," he said, the surprise evident in his voice, "we have been waiting for your call for years. We were beginning to worry. Your grandfather's instructions were very clear. We were not to contact you. We were to wait until you were ready." "I'm ready now," Elara said, her voice devoid of the tremor she felt inside. They met the next day in a discreet, wood-paneled office that smelled of old leather and justice. Marcus Thorne was a small, bird-like man, with eyes that missed nothing. He listened intently as Elara recounted the events of the engagement party, his expression growing grimmer with each word. He did not interrupt. He simply listened, his fingers steepled under his chin. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he gave a short, sharp nod. "Your grandfather was a wise man," he said. "He understood the nature of greed. He always said that the loudest people in the room are usually the most desperate." He leaned forward. "The Beaumont Corporation. I know of them. Flashy, over-leveraged, and deeply in debt. They've been trying to secure a new line of credit for months, but no one will touch them. Their financials are a house of cards. They wanted to marry me to get access to my trust fund," Elara said, the pieces clicking into place. She had a modest trust from her parents, enough to live comfortably, but nothing that would save a failing corporation. "They must have thought it was bigger than it is." Marcus shook his head. "No," he said slowly, a look of dawning realization on his face. "I don't think it was about your trust fund, Miss Hayes." "Not directly." He swiveled in his chair and typed something into his computer. He read the screen for a moment, his eyebrows climbing higher and higher. "Good heavens," he muttered. "The audacity." "What is it?" Elara asked, her heart beginning to pound again. He turned the screen toward her. It was a financial news article from a few weeks prior. The headline read, "Titan Strategic Investments Makes Aggressive Play for Beaumont, Corp Partner, Northwood Development." Northwood Development is the company the Beaumonts are pinning all their hopes on, Marcus explained. They need a merger with Northwood to absorb their debt and gain access to their capital. Without it, they'll be bankrupt within 6 months. Elara looked at him, confused. "What does that have to do with me?" Marcus gave her a small, grim smile. "Titan Strategic Investments is one of your companies, Miss Hayes. A subsidiary of a subsidiary buried so deep no one would ever connect it to Hayes Industries. You are the anonymous entity trying to acquire their only lifeline. They have been fighting you for weeks, and they are losing." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "They weren't trying to marry you for your small trust fund. They were trying to absorb you. They plan to use your name, your clean credit, your signature on loan applications. They likely intended to entangle you so deeply in their fraudulent finances that you would have no choice but to use your personal assets to bail them out, never knowing that you were the one holding the axe over their heads the entire time." The sheer, calculated cruelty of it stole her breath. They hadn't just wanted her money. They had wanted to use her, to ruin her, to make her the scapegoat for their own spectacular failure. Julian's declarations of love, his charming smiles, his promises of a future, it was all a lie, a long, elaborate con. The last vestiges of her grief vanished, incinerated by a white-hot rage. But it was a cold fire, a focused fire. And, "Tell me everything about them," she said to Marcus, her voice low and steady. "I want to know about every debt, every bad deal, every secret they have. I want to know where all the bodies are buried." Marcus Thorne looked at the young woman sitting across from him. He saw the soft features, the quiet demeanor. But for the first time, he also saw the glint of steel in her eyes. He saw Arthur Hayes's granddaughter. "With pleasure, Miss Hayes," he said, a slow, wolfish grin spreading across his face. "With absolute pleasure." For the next 2 weeks, Elara immersed herself in a world she never knew existed. She met with her grandfather's accountant, a matronly woman named Carol, who could read a balance sheet like a poem, and his COO, a no-nonsense man named David, who ran the global operations of Hayes Industries with quiet, ruthless efficiency. They were her grandfather's loyal soldiers, and their loyalty was now hers. They opened the doors to the fortress, and Elara walked in. She spent her days in a secure, anonymous office that Marcus had arranged, poring over documents. She learned about supply chains, patent law, and corporate espionage. She absorbed information with a speed and intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. It was as if a part of her brain that had been dormant her entire life had suddenly awakened. She had her grandfather's mind, his knack for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. Meanwhile, the investigation into the Beaumonts was yielding spectacular results. Marcus hired a team of the best forensic accountants and private investigators money could buy. And Elara, it turned out, had a great deal of money. The picture that emerged was one of staggering fraud and incompetence. Julian and his father had been cooking the books for years, using company funds as their personal piggyback, funding their lavish lifestyle with money they didn't have. They had falsified earning reports, taken out predatory loans against assets they didn't fully own, and were engaged in a desperate, illegal scheme to inflate their company's stock value before the inevitable collapse. The investigators uncovered Julian's string of affairs, his gambling debts, and the contempt with which he spoke about Elara in private messages to his friends. He called her his naive little gold ticket, his clueless cash cow. Each new revelation was like another twist of the knife, but the pain no longer weakened her. It forged her anger into a weapon. During this time, Julian was calling her incessantly. He left dozens of messages, his tone shifting from angry and demanding to confused and pleading. He couldn't understand what had happened. In his world, decorative pieces didn't walk away. They didn't say no. He sent flowers, gifts, long rambling emails professing his undying love and blaming his mother for the misunderstanding with the prenup. Elara deleted every message without listening, returned every gift unopened. She was done. The man she had loved was a ghost, a fiction she had helped create. The man who was leaving her messages was a stranger and a criminal. The plan began to form, not all at once, but in pieces, as she gathered more and more information. It was audacious. It was ruthless. It was exactly what they deserved. The Beaumonts were hosting their annual Founders Gala in 3 weeks. It was their biggest social event of the year, a night where they paraded their success and influence in front of the city's elite. It was the perfect stage. They will be expecting to announce their merger with Northwood Development at that gala. David, the COO, told her during one of their strategy meetings. It's their last-ditch effort to project an image of stability. They've been leaking rumors to the press for days. Good, Elara said, her eyes fixed on the financial projections spread across the table. Let them. Let them build the stage. I'll provide the final act. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place a week before the gala. The investigators found it buried in the county planning office records. A fatal flaw in the Beaumonts' most valuable property, the land on which their flagship skyscraper stood. 20 years ago, Julian's father had acquired the land through a series of shady deals. But a small, crucial parcel in the middle of the plot had never been properly sold. The ownership was still listed under a defunct holding company. A holding company that Arthur Hayes had quietly bought for pennies on the dollar 15 years ago as part of a larger land acquisition. A holding company that Elara now owned. She owned the ground beneath their feet. The very foundation of their fraudulent empire was built on her land. Marcus Thorne whistled, a low, impressed sound. Your grandfather was a grandmaster, he said, shaking his head in awe. He wasn't just playing chess, he was playing it on 10 boards at once, blindfolded. He saw this coming 15 years ago. Elara looked at the deed, at her grandfather's signature on the transfer document. He had left her more than a fortress. He had left her a map, a strategy, and a weapon of such devastating precision it was almost poetic. The Beaumonts were not just going to fall. They were going to be swallowed by the earth. She felt a pang of something that might have been guilt, a fleeting echo of the woman she used to be. But then she remembered Beatrice's cruel words, Julian's casual betrayal. The room full of laughing faces. They had tried to erase her. Her only crime had been to love, to trust, and for that, they had planned her ruin. The guilt vanished. The gala, she said to her team, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. That's where we end this. I want everything in place. The legal notices, the asset freeze, the press release. I want it all to land at exactly 9 o'clock in the middle of Julian's speech. She looked at Marcus. And I want an invitation. Marcus smiled. Ta! Miss Hayes, he said, I believe you own the building. You don't need an invitation. The night of the Founders' Gala was a spectacle of excess. The Beaumont Tower ballroom was ablaze with light, dripping with crystals, and filled with the scent of expensive perfume and desperation. Elara arrived not as a guest, but as an observer. She took a position on a small private balcony, overlooking the main floor hidden in the shadows. From her vantage point, she could see everything. She saw Julian, preening in the spotlight, his arm around a new, equally beautiful, and likely equally clueless young woman. She saw Beatrice, gliding through the crowd like a shark, her smile as sharp and predatory as ever. They looked triumphant. They looked untouchable. They were celebrating a victory they had not yet won, a future that was about to be canceled. Down on the floor, Julian was still trying to reach her. He had been texting her all day, a final desperate barrage of messages. Elara, please, just talk to me. We can fix this. I love you. Don't throw away what we have. He was still playing the part, still trying to manipulate the naive girl he thought she was. He had no idea. He was texting the woman who was about to liquidate his entire existence. At 5 minutes to 9, she sent him a single text back. Her only communication with him in weeks. It was simple. It was final. It said, "Watch the news." She saw him pull out his phone, a frown creasing his handsome face as he read the message. He looked around the room, confused, searching. But he couldn't see her. She was out of his sight, just as his family had always wanted. At precisely 9 o'clock, as Julian stepped up to the podium to begin his speech, the world began to unravel around him. On the large screens behind him, which were supposed to be displaying the Beaumont Corporation logo, a new image appeared. It was the logo of Hayes Industries, stark and unfamiliar. A low murmur went through the crowd. Julian faltered, staring at the screen in confusion. "A slight technical difficulty, it seems," he said, trying to laugh it off, but the laughter died in his throat as every phone in the room began to buzz and chime at once. A news alert had just been pushed out from every major financial publication. Beaumont Corporation, under investigation for massive fraud, assets frozen, CEO Julian Beaumont implicated. The murmur in the room grew into a roar of shock and confusion. People were staring at their phones, then at Julian, their faces, a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Beatrice's face had gone chalk white. She looked like her ice sculpture had finally begun to melt. Julian stood at the podium, frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. "This is a lie," he stammered. "A fabrication, a malicious attack. By our competitors." As if on cue, the main doors to the ballroom swung open. A group of men and women in dark conservative suits walked in. They were led by Marcus Thorne. Behind them were several uniformed federal agents. The room fell into a sudden, deathly silence. Marcus walked to the podium, his steps echoing in the vast, silent space. He took a microphone from the stand. "Julian Beaumont," he said, his voice calm and clear, amplified throughout the ballroom. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I represent Hayes Industries, the primary creditor for the Beaumont Corporation, and the legal owner of the land this building stands on." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Beatrice looked as if she might faint. "As of an hour ago," Marcus continued, "a federal judge has approved a complete freeze of all Beaumont personal and corporate assets, pending a criminal investigation into securities, fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. Furthermore, as the legal landowners, we are serving you with an immediate eviction notice. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." He placed a thick document on the podium in front of Julian. Julian stared at the document, then at Marcus, his face contorted with rage and confusion. "Who are you?" he snarled. "Who is Hayes Industries? I've never even heard of you." From her place in the shadows, Elara stepped forward into the light of the balcony. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, watching him. Julian's eyes followed the collective gaze of the crowd, up to the balcony. When he saw her, his jaw dropped, the color drained from his face. For a long moment, he simply stared, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. The quiet girl, the decorative piece, standing above them all, watching his world burn. "You," he whispered, the word barely audible. "This was you." Elara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the balcony railing. Her voice, when she spoke, was not amplified, but it carried through the stunned silence with perfect clarity. "You once told me my signature was all that was required," she said, her tone even and cold. "You were right, it was. Right here." She held up a document for a brief moment. "At the bottom of the acquisition papers for Northwood Development, and right here," she gestured to the floor below her, "on the deed to this land." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I know my place," she continued, her voice cutting through the silence like a shard of glass. "It's at the head of the table. You, however, seem to have forgotten yours." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the crystal chandeliers, more profound than the marble floors. It was the sound of an entire dynasty collapsing in on itself. Every guest, every society figure, every business partner was a witness to their utter and complete humiliation. The laughter was gone, replaced by a shocked, morbid stillness. Beatrice finally broke. A strangled, animalistic scream tore from her throat as she lunged toward the podium. Her perfectly manicured nails outstretched as if to claw the truth out of the air. The federal agents intercepted her easily, restraining her as she devolved into a tirade of curses and threats. Julian just stood there, a hollowed-out statue, his empire and his future turned to dust around him. Elara watched for a moment longer. She saw the flash of cameras as the press, who had been tipped off, swarmed into the ballroom. She saw the fear and despair on the faces of the people who had mocked her. She felt no triumph, no joy, just a quiet, clean sense of finality. A chapter had ended. A debt had been paid. She turned her back on the chaos and walked away, melting back into the shadows. She didn't need to see the rest. She had already written the ending. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media frenzy. The Beaumont scandal was the story of the year. The details of their fraud were even more sordid than Elara's team had initially uncovered. They had cheated partners, defrauded investors, and were on the verge of bankrupting the pension funds of their own employees. The public downfall was brutal and swift. Elara, through her lawyers, remained anonymous. The media dubbed the mysterious head of Hayes Industries the Ghost of Wall Street, a silent, invisible force that had surgically dismantled one of the city's most powerful families. The narrative was that of a corporate raider, a ruthless predator. They had no idea the ghost was a 26-year-old woman who had simply decided she was done being a decorative piece. She directed her team to handle the dissolution of the Beaumont Corporation with care. Her first priority was the employees. Hayes Industries absorbed the viable parts of the company, saving hundreds of jobs and, most importantly, securing the threatened pension funds. This act of quiet competence and compassion did more to solidify her reputation in the business world than any hostile takeover could have. She wasn't just a destroyer, she was a builder. It was the first time she truly felt her grandfather's legacy flowing through her. Julian and his father were arrested. The evidence against them was overwhelming, a mountain of meticulously documented fraud compiled by Elara's team. They faced a litany of federal charges. Beatrice, while not facing criminal charges initially, was a social and financial pariah. Her friends abandoned her overnight. The banks foreclosed on her homes. She was left with nothing but the public shame of her family's disgrace. One evening, a few weeks after the gala, Marcus brought Elara a small sealed envelope. It had been found in a private safe deposit box belonging to her grandfather, with instructions to be given to her after her first great victory. Elara opened it. Inside was another letter, in his familiar script. "My Ellie," it read, "if you are reading this, it means you have unsheathed the sword. I hope it was not a burden, but a liberation. Power is a tool, nothing more. It can be used to build or to break. The choice is always yours. The Beaumonts of the world will always exist. They are loud, and they are hollow. They build their castles on sand and call them empires. They see people as objects, as tools for their own advancement. Never become them. Your true strength is not in this company or in the wealth it generates. It is in your heart, in the compassion and integrity I saw in you even as a little girl. Use this power to build things that last. Protect those who cannot protect themselves, and never, ever let anyone else define your worth. Your signature is precious. Place it only on things that build a better world, and on the hearts of those who deserve it. I am proud of you, more than you will ever know. Love, Grandpa Arthur. Tears streamed down Elara's face as she read the letter. They were not tears of sadness, but of gratitude and release. He had seen her. He had known her. Completely. She had spent so long feeling lost and small, and all the while he had known the strength that was inside her, waiting. She took control of Hayes Industries, not as a ghost, but as herself. She stepped into the role of CEO. The first board meeting was daunting. The room was filled with older, experienced men who had worked with her grandfather for decades. They looked at her with skepticism, their expressions guarded. She was young. She was a woman. She was an unknown quantity. She didn't try to impress them with bluster or bravado. She simply laid out her plan, a vision for the future of the company that was rooted in her grandfather's principles, but adapted for a new world. She spoke about sustainable growth, ethical investments, and employee welfare. She spoke with a quiet confidence and a depth of knowledge that left them stunned. By the end of the meeting, the skepticism had been replaced by a grudging respect, and then by a genuine enthusiasm. They saw what Marcus had seen. They saw Arthur Hayes's granddaughter. The next year of Elara's life was a blur of hard work and transformation. She proved to be a natural leader with an intuitive grasp of the complex machinery of her company. She streamlined operations, invested in new technologies, and launched a charitable foundation in her grandfather's name, dedicated to providing educational scholarships for underprivileged students in STEM fields. Hayes Industries, which had always been profitable, flourished under her leadership. Its reputation shifted from that of a shadowy, reclusive entity to a forward-thinking, ethical powerhouse. She moved out of her small apartment and into a beautiful but understated home in the countryside, a place with trees and open sky. She found that she didn't crave the opulence that the Beaumonts had chased. She craved authenticity. One day she was overseeing the design plans for a new research campus the company was building. The head architect was a man named Liam. He was tall and kind, with warm, intelligent eyes and a smile that was genuine and easy. He didn't know who she was at first, other than the client. He treated her not as a CEO, but as a partner in the creative process. He listened to her ideas. He challenged them respectfully. He saw her mind, not her title. Their professional meetings slowly bled into coffee, then dinner. He was passionate about his work, about building spaces that were not just functional, but beautiful and humane. He told her about his childhood, about growing up in a small town with a loving family. He was everything Julian had pretended to be. He was solid, he was real. When he eventually found out the full story of who she was, of her connection to the Beaumont scandal, he wasn't impressed by the wealth or the power. He was impressed by her courage. "You must have been terrified," he said one evening, as they sat on the porch of her new home watching the sunset, "to do all that alone." "I wasn't alone," she said, thinking of her grandfather, of Marcus, of her loyal team, "and I wasn't terrified. I was angry, and I was done being silent." He reached across and took her hand. His touch was warm, gentle, a question, not a demand. "Well," he said softly, "I, for one, am very glad you found your voice. It's a beautiful one." In that simple, quiet moment, Elara felt a sense of peace she had never known. This was real. This was a partnership of equals, built on respect and admiration, not on deception and greed. She was finally being loved for who she was, not for what she had. A year after the gala, Marcus sent her a small news clipping. It was a brief article from a local paper. Julian and his father had been sentenced 20 years in federal prison for fraud. The accompanying photo showed Julian being led from the courthouse in handcuffs. He looked broken, a ghost of the handsome, arrogant man he had been. The article mentioned in passing that Beatrice Beaumont was now working as a cashier in a discount supermarket on the outskirts of the city, living in a small rented room. She had lost everything. Her name, her status, her wealth, her entire world had been built on a lie, and the truth had been a wrecking ball. Elara read the article and felt a surprising lack of emotion. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, just a quiet sense of closure. Their story was over. Hers was just beginning. She had taken their cruelty and betrayal and used it as fuel to become the woman her grandfather had always known she could be. They had tried to make her a footnote in their story, but instead, she had become the author of her own. She put the clipping away and went back outside to join Liam, who was tending to the small garden they had planted together. The sun was warm on her face. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers. She looked at the life she had built, a life of purpose, of integrity, and of quiet joy. She was not a decorative piece. She was the architect, and she was finally truly free. She had learned the most important lesson her grandfather had tried to teach her. The world will only give you the value you demand for yourself. She had stopped accepting disrespect as an obligation, and in doing so, had found that her own quiet knowledge was more powerful than all the loud, empty promises in the world. She was living the life she truly deserved, a life built not on a crumbling foundation of lies, but on the solid ground she now owned.